Today's lecture, to begin with, is Cultural Diplomacy Case Studies, Germany and Europe. As I mentioned, we had a chance earlier in the week to glaze over some of these issues with the earlier lecture. I want to focus on just three countries right now: Germany, France, and the United Kingdom. On the one hand, I want to zoom in a little bit closer into a few institutions from each of these countries. On the other hand, I want to talk a little bit about the bigger picture, what's happening in terms of the transitions that we've seen in Germany, also the transitions we've seen in France, and finally the United Kingdom, where there's been an even greater transition in terms of the British Council, in particular over the last 5 to 10 years. So this is hopefully a chance for us to get a little bit more up close and personal to each one of these examples. So in terms of the overall picture, as I said, cultural diplomacy in Europe more or less began end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s. France is the oldest example. One of the things we'll notice throughout this lecture is the interplay between politics and conflicts and cultural diplomacy. And I think it's not random that the cultural diplomacy institutions emerged as they did when they did in Europe. And I think very much it is due to the historical context. Usually right after a big conflict, you then see the birth of some of the biggest cultural diplomacy institutions. So I want to begin actually with Germany, since in many ways, as I was saying, this is, I think, one of the strongest examples of a country really for almost the entire century has been dedicating a lot of resources and a lot of effort to cultural diplomacy. Then we'll go to France, then we'll go to the United Kingdom. So first of all, as I mentioned earlier, the interesting thing about Germany is the structure of their foreign ministry. You really have three pillars. And this is one of the unique examples of a foreign ministry that has this in the world: the political pillar, the economic pillar, and the cultural pillar. And I think it really says a lot about German foreign policy, the fact that that's actually how they divide the foreign ministry, almost equally. The other points that I mentioned is that the cultural part, or the cultural pillar of the foreign ministry, has a bigger budget than the others. Again, quite interesting that really not only is there this equalization of the three pillars, but they're actually privileging culture even more. So just in terms of the structure, that makes Germany unique. As you know, in the USA at the end of the Cold War, we'll come to this in the next lecture, they basically at the end of the Cold War cut all of the cultural diplomacy, pushed it within the State Department, sort of a smaller program, and they actually killed sort of the one organization they had, this institute, or the Information Center, the United States Information Agency. So Germany, again, the context is quite unique. What I'd like to do is mention the key cultural diplomacy institutions of Germany, and then just zero in on three of them. Goethe-Institut, of course, is one of the most famous. Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst, the German Academic Exchange Service, and Deutsche Welle. Those are the three that I want to focus on now. Just for your information, the Institut für Außenbeziehungen is also a big player. They're based in Stuttgart, doing a lot of research and publications in the field of cultural diplomacy, cultural relations. So I won't go into depth there, but I'm happy to take questions on that. Also the German schools. Many of you may know there are German schools, or the Deutsche Schule, around the world, where in New York or in Paris you can actually go and actually get a high school education or elementary school education in German. They also play a really big role. But I'm going to leave those out for now, just in the sake of time, so that we can zero in on the other three. And in addition to those five, of course, there are many other non-governmental and also some other governmental initiatives in the field of cultural diplomacy. But these are, in my opinion, sort of the leading five. So what I'd like to do, as I said, is zoom in now a little bit on, in particular, the first three. So the first example is Goethe-Institut. Named after Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the Goethe-Institut was founded in 1951 as the successor to the German Academy. So again, let's look at the date. I don't think this is a coincidence, obviously in 1951. And again, we'll see this with the French, also with the British. I think in many ways this was part of the response of Germany to saying, all right, something went wrong in the sense. You know, we had the Second World War, you know, League of Nations, all these other things don't seem to be working. What can we do differently? And I think there was the realization, obviously foreign policy, democracy, all kinds of other issues, but that was really the realization. Cultural diplomacy is actually more important than ever. So even though this isn't the beginning of cultural diplomacy for Germany, this was a new emphasis to do more. So 1951 it began. In accordance with the Foreign Office, between 1959 and 1960, it gradually took over all German cultural institutes abroad. In agreement with the Foreign Office, it became an independent cultural organization in 1976. So initially it was governmental. Then in 1976, technically non-governmental, but of course very much influenced by the governments and to a large degree funded by the government. Goethe Institute is a non-profit, politically independent body, however in many cases acts on behalf of the Federal Republic of Germany to coordinate cultural and educational activities. And in some cases they'll actually do also political activities through sort of the embassy of the Goethe Institute. So there is a close link. It's not totally independent in that sense. Much of the Goethe Institute's overall budget, approximately 278 million euro, consists of yearly grants from the German Foreign Office and the German Press Office. But more than half is generated from language course tuition and examination fees. This is interesting as we compare it to China. As we saw yesterday, China makes their classes very cheap, sometimes free of charge. Goethe Institute, this is a primary revenue source. So in some cases, actually half of their budget comes from those fees. So a big difference also in the Chinese case, where they're actually dependent on this. As I mentioned in Berlin, one of the most expensive options to learn German is Goethe Institute. So again, you could see that perhaps as a disadvantage of this model, because it doesn't make it as accessible as, for example, Confucius Institute. There are now, I think there are more than this, but there are at least 136 institutes in the world, present in 91 countries. So also fairly big, not quite the Confucius Institute, but fairly substantial in terms of their magnitude. The agenda. What is the Goethe Institute trying to do? The Goethe Institute, as the cultural institute of the Federal Republic of Germany, brings the multifaceted image of Germany to the world. It provides access to German language, culture, and society, and promotes international cultural cooperation. And this is from the Goethe website. They also provide, as I said, language courses, teaching materials, and teacher training, very similar to Confucius. Encourage cultural collaboration by organizing international events and contributing to festivals and exhibitions in the field of film, dance, and literature. By the way, in China, they just recently did a big event you may have heard of on the Enlightenment, which is a really large-scale exhibition in China that was initially a big controversy. Would the Chinese allow it? In the end, they did allow it. But in that case, they're also quite active in Asia. Establish libraries and information centers, and promote international discourse on the key concerns of an increasingly global society. So those are the official goals and missions of the Goethe Institute. The vehicle, again, we're all, I think, fairly familiar with this. Language training, I think, is at the core of Goethe Institute. That was really when they began at the center. And then since then, they've gradually expanded more and more to do all kinds of cultural events, lectures, concerts, exhibitions. So now the Berlin office of the Goethe Institute, as an example, is right near Hackescher Markt, very close to where the British Council used to be. So a very lively part of town where you could say becoming one of the cultural centers of Berlin. Kurfürstendamm, where ICD is the western part of Berlin. That used to really be the center of divided Berlin. Hackescher Markt, many would argue, is really becoming the new center today in the eastern part. So again, an intentional choice of Goethe to be in sort of a trendy part of town, relatively accessible to tourists as well as Berliners. So those are their main vehicles. Target audience would be catering for the popular, more specific interests of the general public. So technically anyone can actually go there and take a Goethe Institute course if you can pay the fee. The events that they do are usually free of charge. But again, their guest list isn't, in my opinion, sort of, a cross-section of society. But it's more sort of the key stakeholders, people from the cultural field, academia, etc. So again, I would encourage Goethe to think how they might be able to open up Goethe Institute to a wider audience. Although they do very good work with high schools. So in that sense, that's one way I think they're trying to connect to more average citizens. As I point out here, the new target audience is high school students, where they see that also as a way of entering into the cross-section. Since 2008, there's been a new emphasis also of the Goethe Institute in Africa, where they're trying to really expand their work around the world. And then also, they're combining sports as a way of also getting people interested in the German language. So organizing sporting activities or games around the world. So they're beginning to branch out a little bit more, but essentially their core still remains language training and actually representing German culture abroad by bringing German authors, German writers, German actors technically to come and speak and do events, whether it's the Goethe Institute in Ljubljana in Slovenia or in New York. So again, one of the classical cultural diplomacy agencies, Goethe Institute remains the main cultural representation of Germany abroad, in addition to the embassy. So those are sort of the key points with Goethe. One of the things I'll just conclude with is Goethe is going through a process right now of re-examining their identity and also the strategy for the future. They hired, I believe it was McKinsey, to actually do an evaluation of the whole thing. And it's a little bit in flux right now. We actually had a speaker at ICD not too long ago from the headquarters in Bavaria who is letting us know a little bit about this. But it's again the question, what is the role of Goethe Institute in the future? Is it really necessary for Goethe to be offering German language classes? Should they work closer with universities similar to Confucius? Confucius is usually embedded within a university. Goethe is usually a standalone building. And then the other big question remains also funding. Is this something that will continue to be only partially funded from the government? What are the benefits and disadvantages of charging these relatively significant fees for taking tests there or languages? So I think this is a model which also probably will change in the coming years. So the second example I touched on in my introductory lecture, and I said this is one of my favorite examples of cultural diplomacy, the Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst, the German Academic Exchange Service. Again, let's go over some key points, and then I want to mention a few things also about how or what the cultural diplomacy student can learn from this model of cultural diplomacy. First of all, German Academic Exchange Service was founded in 1925. So again, an interesting time. Obviously now this is before the Second World War, after the First World War. And I think in many ways, I would argue also, this tremendous conflict of the First World War certainly played a role here as well. And I think this is part of the German strategy to say, okay, how do we build more bridges? Especially, the French-German relations at many times were quite urgent then, but also in a broader whole. European Union, all of these things were to come later. And I think this was one of the first steps where Germany, I would argue, was actually ahead of the game in saying, all right, let's have this academic exchange as one possible bridge to keep us better connected with our neighbors and also the rest of the world. Right now, as I said, the world's largest funding organization that supports international exchange of students and scholars. That's partially true in the sense, as I said, Erasmus is actually bigger. That's a European initiative for exchange, but you have 27 countries paying for that. DAAD is just German funding, so it's the largest national educational exchange program. They have 229 higher education institutions and 123 student bodies of higher education institutions who are members of the German Foreign Ministry. And the funding is mixed here. So I wanted to actually show you this pie chart. Hopefully you can see it on the PowerPoint. I'll read you the statistics. So 47% of the budget of DAAD is from the federal government's foreign office, so the Auswärtiges Amt, or the German Foreign Ministry. 21% is the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. 9% the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. So those three things together is roughly 75% of their budget. So not all of it comes from the German government, but roughly 75, 76%-ish from different departments of the German government. What's interesting, this is also a recent developments in the last, let's say, 10, 20 years. 17% of their budget today comes from the European Union. And 6% of their budget is other, where they get grants or they also collaborate, for example, with Fulbright and other organizations. So basically governmentally funded from Germany, but Europe is having an increasing role as well. So that's the funding and the agent, DAAD. The agenda, what is the point of DAAD? According to them, the DAAD is a joint organization of Germany's higher education institutions and is mandated to promote international academic relations, especially through the exchange of students, academics, and scientists. DAAD facilitates academic exchange without setting a specific program. So again, as I was mentioning yesterday, one of the key points of their agenda is really facilitating access. And they claim, and I think to a large degree it's true, they don't really influence how those students use the access. There are some priorities of the German government. For example, sometimes they'll say, all right, we want to have more people coming from this country or this region, or we want to make it more accessible for scientists from Eastern Europe or this and that. So there are some priorities there. So if we look a little bit deeper, in terms of also where they're working, how many scholarships they offer in different places, which categories of scholarships they offer. But putting that aside, essentially, again, I can say this as a participant myself, you really have academic freedom once you're a fellow of the DAAD and can basically do what you want. And I think that's a very important part of the agenda, but also the way in which DAAD works. The vehicle. How do they do it? They run over 250 programs with 5 strategic goals. 1, provide scholarships for foreigners, which is 83 million. Now, these are recent statistics as of 1 or 2 years. Provide scholarships for German, 94 billion. So you can see almost the same. So they're actually spending a little bit more money sending Germans abroad, but just about the same amount bringing foreigners to Germany. They spend 63 million in the internationalization of German institutions, so making, let's say, German universities more international, whether it's bringing faculty, students, etc., to those universities. 4, promote German studies and the German language abroad, 43 million. And then 5, assist developing countries in the Southern Hemisphere and reforming countries in the former Eastern Bloc in the establishment of higher education systems, and that's 65 million. In addition, they offer advice to decision makers on matters of cultural education and development policy. So basically academic exchange, but really at all levels. So faculty, staff, as well as students. And they're, as you can see here, partnering with many institutions around the world. To conclude, their target audience, as I said, on the one hand is huge, it's the entire world. On the other hand is very limited. It's actually usually those people who are somehow involved with academia, which as we know is not really representative of the population of the world. So here German and foreign scholars and academics, other organizations that support international exchange of students and scholars. And then DAD is also present, so this is just a quote there, at many trade fairs around the world. But the key thing for me when I look at the target audience is on the one hand, definitely I think DAD should be commended, and then I think there really it does give access to actually citizens from around the world. But we can't forget only those people who actually have access to education. As we discussed also in the first lecture, I really think the fundamental challenge separating human beings in the world is really the challenge of access. Some individuals in the world have access to what they want and they need, some don't. So DAD is helping in terms of facilitating access here. But again, you do need to actually have that first step to already be within the academic system, so to speak, in order to get entry to this. But assuming you've passed that test and you are in a university somewhere or you qualify for a DAD, then it's great. And I think the difference between DAD and Confucius Institute in terms of the lecture that we had before is DAD really, I haven't ever heard of a controversy about DAD that they try to influence, how they teach German history or this and that. So I think really it has succeeded at staying neutral. And I think really, I would argue, I'd be happy to hear also comments and questions that they do really focus on this goal of facilitating access. So the only detections sometimes of a political agenda is, as I said, sometimes they will prioritize certain regions of the world for strategic reasons in terms of giving more scholarships to one place or another place. Aside from that, I think it really is free from agenda. And for me, the takeaway points from this model of cultural diplomacy is this idea of just facilitating the access and leaving the rest up to the participant. This is something maybe Confucius Institutes, others could also learn from. And I think there it's a point really since the beginning of DAD that's remained until today. Not to mess with the exchanges themselves, not to influence what kinds of courses, what kinds of experiences these students have, but really just to see their role as facilitating access. So that's for me the key lesson learned from the DAD. Feel free as I'm going also to ask questions or clarify. Otherwise, we can also do it in the discussion in the end. Third example that I wanted to give in Germany is to zoom in a little bit closer into Deutsche Welle. Now, Deutsche Welle, as I think we all know, is the 4th largest international TV broadcaster in the world. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, and then Deutsche Welle. So in terms of TV, it's a huge international broadcaster in terms of news. The radio, as I mentioned, is roughly 30, if not 31 languages. The internet is also 30 to 31 languages. So here again, Deutsche Welle is Germany's international broadcaster, comprising shortwave, internet radio, satellite television service in 4 languages, and online, as I said, 30 languages. It was initially established in 1953. So again, I think in many ways a response to the Second World War, where Germany said, all right, let's again invest more money. Let's create a new institution, which at the time was fairly unique, to really broadcast German news, German information, the voice of Germany around the world. Welle, as you may know, means wave. So German wave is the translation of Deutsche Welle. It was made an independent body then in 1960. So again, initially governmental, later on made independent. As I was referring in my introductory lecture, we can question, is it truly independent? But technically in 1960 was made independent. And then a national broadcasting station as well in 1962. They have 1,500 employees from over 60 countries. And this is something I want to stress because I think really Deutsche Welle tries to work very closely with local communities, which is impressive. I initially thought, all right, the Deutsche Welle office in South Africa is probably going to be mostly Germans, producing German news, etc. Wrong. It's actually mostly South Africans. And I think that's an important way, again, practicing cultural diplomacy. So not only in terms of what they're doing, but also how they do it. They really are very international. Also, the offices here in Berlin is where the TV TV is headquartered. The radio is headquartered in Bonn. Again, I see more foreigners working there than I actually see Germans working there. So truly an international organization. They have nearly 90 million listeners and viewers each week, almost entirely governmentally funded. The 2009 budget consisted of 291 million in federal allowances and 15 million in other income. So not totally governmental, but almost. So the agenda, what is the official agenda of this broadcasting organization? Deutsche Welle aims to promote understanding of Germany as an independent nation with its roots in European culture and as a liberal, democratic, constitutional state based on the rule of law, in order to provide a forum for German and other points of view on important issues with the aim of fostering understanding and exchange between cultures and people. So you can see they're almost a little bit taken from Milton Cummings there in terms of, again, culture diplomacy, fostering mutual understanding. However, the first sentence alone does show us a little bit of the angle. So the goal is to promote the understanding of Germany as an independent nation with its roots in the European culture. So they have a bit of an agenda there, you can see, even as they officially express it. They're trying to show a certain version of Germany that they believe is the accurate version and the correct version to the rest of the world. Other goals: produce multilingual media services for a global audience, communicate both German and global perspectives, promote intercultural dialogue and work further to international understanding, provide comprehensive and uncensored information in countries that lack free media, especially conflict regions and war zones, and use its credibility to promote Germany's reputation worldwide. So again, even from their webpage, you can see here, not total neutrality. So there is a bit of an agenda here, especially the last sentence there, using credibility to promote Germany's reputation abroad. So again, this is something for us to think about. You know, what do we make of this model? Is that okay to have sort of a news organization with the goal of also promoting a certain country? So I'd be curious to hear your feedback on that. The vehicle, as I mentioned, TV, radio, internet. Deutsche Welle has over 200 partners in Africa, for example. The educational program Learning by Ear focuses on civil society, democratization, and good governance, exploring issues such as globalization and the dangers of HIV/AIDS, aiming to reach 33 million adolescents, and is broadcast in Hausa, Aramaic, and Swahili languages. So that's also, I think, an interesting example where they are going beyond just offering TV programs, and actually they're saying, all right, look, you know, if we're active in a certain region, how can we engage with that region? How can we also provide services or information that can actually help? So I think that's also an interesting component of Deutsche Welle, just so you realize it's not just what happens on the TV screen. The International Training Institute is another example. DW Academy prepares 20 trainees from all over the world each year to become future editors. In collaboration with the University of Bonn, it also offers a 2-year master's program open to 25 students. So obviously those are small numbers there, but again, you can see though, these are other initiatives of Deutsche Welle trying to actually assist in other ways. So let's train foreigners, you know, how to be editors, etc. So interesting initiative, would be great, obviously, if it could be increased. One of the challenges, I didn't mention this when I was talking about the agent, Deutsche Welle, as I said, is broadcast only outside of Germany, but every year they need to actually get the support of the German parliaments and the German governments to renew its budget. So they have a constant problem where they're actually trying to get their funding from Germany, and Germany more or less doesn't really know or doesn't really experience Deutsche Welle. So funding is always an issue for Deutsche Welle, which is probably why the numbers are relatively small in terms of their additional activities beyond the news. The audience, the programming and information provided by Deutsche Welle is targeted to anyone interested in Germany and Europe, but not in particular, opinion leaders and future opinion leaders. In its promotion of the German language, Deutsche Welle serves a specific target audience, those who teach German, speak German, or want to learn. In countries where freedom of the press or freedom of expression are limited, especially in areas of conflict or crisis, Deutsche Welle provides an outside voice, offering objective, unfiltered information. And as I mentioned, it's not broadcast in Germany, so obviously that's not part of the target audience. So again, it's interesting. As we review the official target audience of Deutsche Welle, again, it's not totally random. And I think there they do actually have different goals in different places. And I know this is a fact also in some parts of the world where there are conflict or where you don't have freedom of expression or freedom of the media. Deutsche Welle really does make a conscientious effort to say, hey, look, here's another side of the story. And I think does play a very important role to at least offer alternative versions of the news. Whether it's neutral, we can debate later. But I think definitely compared to some of the alternatives, at times is very neutral. So I think that's interesting as well. So What I take away from the model of Deutsche Welle is the fact that basically they're using one of the strongest instruments in the world, namely the media. As we all know, TV, radio, internet is probably the most powerful way to actually reach individuals in the world. So that's interesting. Not so many countries are doing that. They're doing it not only in their own language, but in quite a few languages. So TV, as I said, I think it's up to 5 now from the 4 languages, internet 30, etc. So again, they're trying to speak in the language of their target audiences. And in addition to that, they have a bit of a purpose. I mean, as we see here in terms of promoting sort of the image of Germany abroad, but also promoting values such as freedom of expression and democracy. So again, I wouldn't say Deutsche Welle is neutral in that sense, but maybe that's okay in the sense maybe it's legitimate. You know, if Germany believes in freedom of expression and believes in democracy, this and that, why not have one of their main cultural diplomacy institutions also promoting that around the world? Of course, Americans, I think, are doing the same way. I mean, I think American cultural diplomacy, again, it's their version of the world. The things that the Americans believe in as being important certainly influence also American cultural diplomacy. So these are, I think, legitimate goals or agendas. However, again, this is for the debate later I want to discuss with you. Is there a disadvantage in the sense, could we maybe optimize the model of Deutsche Welle so that it's more effective? If they broadcast it in Germany, for example, would that give it more authenticity? I had a debate once in the German Foreign Office. I usually teach a seminar there every year for their diplomats before they actually go out in the real world, so sort of the cultural attachés, the political attachés. And I was asking them the question, Deutsche Welle or RTL? RTL, some of you may know, is sort of one of the main private TV stations in Germany, where they have Deutschland sucht der Superstar, or Germany's, how do you translate that? It's the American Idol version, so basically the talent show of Germany. And just as an example, many Germans watch RTL. No Germans watch Deutsche Welle. So what actually would be a better representation of Germany? So if I'm as an American, I want to get to know Germany, you know, the argument could be made, I should be watching what the Germans are watching, not what the Germans are making for me. So this is again something to think about. The French, we'll come to later, but they also have TV5, for example, TV5, which is actually the French station broadcast abroad. So they're actually doing what I kind of suggested to the German government, taking their own TV stations and broadcasting them, as opposed to making a prepackaged one just for foreigners or just for the rest of the world. So these are things I'd love to debate with you as well. But I think it's definitely a huge magnitude. I mean, just these 3 institutions alone, you can see really the amount of resources that Germany is investing in cultural diplomacy. I think it's unparalleled by almost any country. So I want to go now to France. I'll take a sip of coffee. So the French example, again, we could have a 2-hour lecture just on France. We could actually do a semester-long lecture just on France. So I'm, again, not going to give you a complete presentation of French cultural diplomacy, but really a very brief presentation on essentially 2 examples, Institut Français, and then this example of what I was referring to in the opening lecture, negative cultural diplomacy, again, to see what we can take away from the French and maybe adapt in our own versions of cultural diplomacy. First of all, the historical context of French cultural diplomacy is important. I made reference to this earlier. The Institut Français began unofficially in the 1800s, officially in 1907. And actually, for the historical context, I'll fast forward it here. So the first institute was technically 1907. And again, I would argue the facts are that the whole colonial experience of France, I think in many ways did impact also their cultural diplomacy. So again, this is this interplay between the politics and the history and the cultural diplomacy. And this idea of really French exceptionalism, I would make the argument you could trace back to the colonial time, where really there they had this idea, you know, this great French nation should really spread around the world. And they should offer their great, you know, cultural gifts to the world. And of course, you know, those countries should be speaking French as opposed to their own country. And of course, the French educational system is better, so we should take out their educational system and bring theirs. And of course, the great French culture is wonderful, and everybody should love this. So that's why we should really push this also on other communities. The colonial period was obviously a very exceptional period, but I would argue you can see hints of this even in some of the French cultural diplomacy today, which is intensified, obviously, since the de Gaulle period and also anti-Americanism, etc. See, we have a question, so if maybe we could just bring the microphone to make sure that we can hear it, or a comment. And as I said, for all of you, feel free to ask questions as we go along, or make comments, please.
My question is a little bit because you just said with the colonial issue. Do you think that countries that today have a history of French colonialism are maybe less likely to have a more diverse range of higher education that they're available to go into because of the French language? So say for example, actually Burkina Faso.
Okay.
People in Burkina Faso, for them, it would be hard to, for example, go to an English university because most of the high schools are in French. The most taught language is French. And as we heard yesterday, only 1% of the world population speaks French. And most of them speak English. So do you think that's maybe a problem rather than something that helps?
Oh, well, that's a big question. So I think obviously there are many problems that colonialism caused. Obviously the first issue I made reference to the other day too, the political map of Africa has nothing to do with the cultural map. So that alone causes many issues, just the groupings of people. And of course, I think every language is a benefit and a disadvantage in the sense the benefit of French is it does give people then access to many countries. The disadvantage, of course, if you compare it to English or Chinese or Arabic, is very limited in terms of actually how many people speak French. So my answer, of course, yes, it is a disadvantage, but that's a deep question too. Obviously we could spend a semester just discussing also the colonial experience, which I think destroyed so many things and caused so many challenges. I don't think it's to blame for all of the challenges that Africa faces today, but a lot of them, of course. And I think that also is a question, then also a question we were discussing also in the earlier lecture, responsibility. What responsibility does France have today? And it's very tricky. Germany's dealing with this issue too. What responsibility does Germany have also regarding the Holocaust? So these are deep questions, but the short answer is yes, I think it is a disadvantage, of course. But you could also see it as an advantage. I spend a lot of time in Tunisia, and I think those Tunisians, most of them speak French. That does give them more access than if they were just speaking Arabic. So there are benefits too, especially as they want to enter the European Union, do more trade, etc. with the European Union. So yes and no. As a brief response. So yes, Institut Français, as I said, it began, I think you can trace a lot of what they're doing to this colonial time period. I don't want to belabor this point too much, but we just have to be aware of the context that was there when these institutions came about. So then you have an evolution, which is a little bit complex, and I'm going to superficially generalize it. 1950, you then had these creations of Institut Français cultural centers. 2006, there was a version of the name change, Culture France. 2010, the official change to the French Institute, Institut Français. But it's more complicated than that. If you go to different countries around the world, there are different names. Here in Berlin, they have the Maison de France, which is the Institut Français, also Alliance Française, also Cinéma de Paris. In New York, it's called FIAF, or French Institute Alliance Française. So ignore the name for now, because it's been changing over the years, and it still has different names in different countries. Let's focus more on the institution itself. Institut Français as a whole consists of 150 French institutes and over 1,000 French alliances, or Alliance Française. Terms I'm using more or less interchangeably, but feel free if anyone wants to comment on this or give more specific examples of either one of them. Very often attached to the French embassy, but with the status of an autonomous financial institution, funded mostly or partly by its own revenue, language courses and sponsorship. So similar a little bit to Goethe Institute there. The financial investment on behalf of the French state is needed, however, to maintain the network as a whole. So again, I would argue basically a governmental institution. Again, they're claiming to be non-governmental, but I know many cases in the world where you have the French culture attaché from the embassy, who's also the director of the Institut Français, and there's a lot of interplay there. So for me, I would classify it basically governmental. But in terms of revenue, as we see similar to Goethe, they are earning money off of language courses, as well as sponsorship, whether it's corporate sponsors, etc. Another component, I guess we can mention in the agent slide as well, is the francophonie. The francophonie also plays a big role for the Institut Français. They see part of their role as actually also promoting the francophonie. They do at least once a year a film festival where they have films from the entire francophonie region, so Canada, the African countries, etc. So that's also a little bit part of their mandate. And I think through that they can also get partners and sponsors, so whether it's Canadian sponsors, etc., when they deal with the francophonie. And there is a good cooperation between the Institut Français and the Canadian embassies. In Germany, we have the unique situation too, where Quebec also has their own embassy or their own representation office as part of the foreign agenda of Quebec. So there again, there's also cooperation with Quebec. But let's stay focused on Institut Français. The agenda, what is the goal of the Institut Français? First of all, part of a government's wish to entrust to a single agency the development of cultural activities abroad. So basically, the French government wants to kind of delegate as many of their cultural tasks to the Institut Français. So you could say the Cultural Embassy of France abroad. Promote artistic exchange across the performing arts, visual arts, and architecture. Broadcast French culture, language, literature, science, cinema, and knowledge. encourage the reception of foreign cultures in France through the organization of seasons or festivals, as I mentioned also the Francophonie festivals, cooperate with regions of the South through the management of the Fond Sud Cinema, support of South Cinema, and partnership of the Centre National de Cinéma et de l'Image Animée, organize the international residency program in France and abroad, and train teachers and define content of instruction. So again, similar to Confucius almost, where they'll actually provide educational materials to schools. So again, it's a fairly expansive agenda, trying to do many things, but essentially bringing French culture and French cultural entities or objects or expressions to the rest of the world, to summarize. The vehicle. They have a number of different aspects we could talk about. First of all, the Department of Development and Partnerships within the Institut Français is responsible for cultural festivals, seasons, and years, such as the year 2010 France-Russia. And during that year, they actually had all kinds of activities to really show the strong French-Russian relationship. And so essentially just a series of different events. The benefit of calling it a year or a festival like this is actually PR. So by grouping it together, they can actually have, it's easier for the posters around the city, etc. But that's one of their strategies for bringing French culture or making sure French culture is more on the radar screen. Also, international residency program they're also responsible for. Exchanges and artistic collaborations between France, Africa, and the Caribbean. Promotion and dissemination of the French intellectual establishments to foreign audiences. The French Institute in Germany, as a recent example, did an exhibition called Grand Paris in Berlin, the future of our cities. So again, talking more indirectly about sort of the future of cities, but then giving focus, of course, to the great city of Paris and the great city of Berlin. So a little bit of indirect culture diplomacy can be seen there as well. Target audience is, again, fairly mixed, but for the most part, students enrolled in their language courses. So that's the one way you can access them, by paying to actually take a language course. Performing artists, visual artists, architects. So the other way is if you actually participate in one of their exchanges, where they bring artists, academics, etc., back and forth between France and other countries. And also through the events, I didn't put this on the slide, actually anyone can go. So here in Berlin, they're fairly accessible. Great location, right on Kurfürstendamm, basically open to the public. So the movie theater, again, you have to pay to get in, but I think it's a normal average ticket price to actually see movies there. And then the exhibitions are usually free of charge, so you can just walk in and see the photo exhibitions or the painting exhibitions. Their events usually are by invitation only, but I've never actually seen them checking the guest list when I'm there. So technically, again, if you hear about an event, you can more or less go. So I would say relatively accessible. On the other hand, just the fact that they're here on the western part of the city, Charlottenburg, Kurfürstendamm, is a limiting factor. On the one hand, it's accessible for everyone who lives here or the people who go shopping on Kurfürstendamm, but of course, not every Berliner does. And in that sense, again, I would argue they could do more to maybe work in other parts of the city, also eastern parts of the city, to create, again, more access. Places of the city where maybe there's less experience with France. You could argue that the West Berliners around Charlottenburg maybe have also traditionally a closer relationship to France due to many things. I mean, high culture, news, history, etc. I think the eastern part of Berlin probably has less experience for historical reasons, but also cultural reasons with France. So again, this is something, again, I encourage the students of cultural diplomacy to always think about. What is the target audience, and is it the correct target audience, or should it be expanded? The other point I mentioned here in target audience, mostly concentrated in Europe. So if you look at actually the resources and also where the Institut Français is present around the world, the concentration is Europe. And I think this is again to do with Second World War, First World War, also the European Union context. I mean, priority-wise, Europe is important for France. Europe also is really, or France sees its role as really one of the leaders of Europe with Germany. One personal anecdote from ICD, we were talking to the French embassy, this is many years ago, I think 7, 8 years ago, about creating a young leaders program for Europe, where we would bring young leaders together from all over Europe. And the big debate that they had is if they wanted to have a strategy of influence or a strategy of exchange. And what they meant by that, strategy of exchange, is that they do a European young leaders program with young leaders from all over Europe. The strategy of influence is that they do a French-German young leaders program, and the idea is that they would then influence the rest of Europe. I ICD was, of course, in favor for the first option, in the sense multilateral, every European. In the end, they decided to go the other way, and they created another young leaders program between France and Germany. I think it was a mistake, but again, it's a little bit symbolic of, I think, the importance that France sees. I mean, France really sees itself as a leader in Europe, and they want to keep that position any way they can. So I think that also somewhat influences their target audience. So that's in essence the Institut Français, more or less the equivalent of the Goethe Institute from France. Unique in the historical developments, and I think also unique in the style of culture diplomacy, which is a little bit more showing great French culture abroad. I don't want to say in an arrogant way, but it's a different style than Germany. Germany is also not perfect, but I think with Germany there's a little bit more humility there. I think they were forced since the Second World War to have a little bit more humility, whereas this exceptionalism of France you can still see, especially in what I'm about to speak about, negative culture diplomacy. But I see I've inspired a comment or a question there, so if we could bring the microphone to the front, if someone could bring that, would be great. And this is good. You're setting a good example, because I want to have interaction here, so you guys really shouldn't be shy. Please.
Yeah, it's more of a comment, actually, because something you just said I really think is actually very true. Since I lived in Brussels, and of course there's a lot of international schools, European schools. There's also a Deutsche Schule, like you said, okay. And I actually have friends from the Deutsche Schule, and so I've talked to them a lot about similar things. You know, what is it like to be in a different country and to learn German in a German environment, etc. And my mum works for the Lycée Français, which is a French school, funded also partially by the French government, and so is the Deutsche Schule. But as you just said, there's quite a bit of a difference between how those schools are run. For example, in the Deutsche Schule, they're very autonomous. So they have quite a lot of leeway as to what curriculum they choose, what for materials they choose. Whereas with the Lycée Français, my mom, for example, teaches German there. And sometimes she would like to maybe use her own books or something. But she has a set curriculum and a set amount of books that she has to use. And whether she likes the books or not is not important. And she has, for example, for the final reports, she will actually have to go to France and participate in Lille in a huge conference, which takes 4 hours to get there and 4 hours back. Okay. And not paid for accommodation, for example, but another issue. Okay. But okay. Generally, that is made a bit more difficult, so I feel like there's a bit more of a political influence there. So like you said, the Germans are maybe, in that particular context, you know, maybe a bit more autonomous. That's just my comment. Thank you.
No, thank you for that. No, it's I think very interesting, direct example of I think a broader phenomena. The issue that you were talking about with the schools is probably due to a number of reasons. Partially, what I was talking about, I think, sort of the general style and sort of agenda of culture diplomacy. Partially, also due, I think, to the centralization of France, where in general in France everything is controlled. I mean, there, different kinds of cheese can only be produced in certain regions of France. Appellation contrôlée. So I mean, I think everything in France almost is really decided in Paris, and this is probably one of those things. So I think it's not only because of the culture diplomacy agenda, but I'm sure also due to the centralization of France. But it's important, and again, we'll discuss a little bit later also. Future of culture diplomacy. What do we think is the most sustainable method? I mean, does it make sense? I won't say to do propaganda, but to try to project certain images of your country. Is that really something that we see as being sustainable in the future, the globalized world? Or should it be more just facilitating access? I mean, France, China, etc. definitely believe, all right, no, there's a certain image of our country, we want to project it. And I have mixed feelings there. I think culture diplomacy can help sometimes to supplement partial information, also to correct misinformation. But I think one has to be very careful as to how it's done. I mean, it sounds like you were sort of maybe negatively influenced by the French school experience in the sense, you could tell also with your comment, in the sense you saw that that's a disadvantage. And that's maybe working counterproductively for France. If they're going to invest these resources and do all of this, they don't want to have people coming away from it saying, the Germans are much more autonomous, this and that. So I think we do need to really self-examine our strategies and see if we're actually shooting ourselves in the leg, so to speak, or accomplishing our goals over the long term. So that would be, I guess, again, everything I would categorize so far positive culture diplomacy. I referred in the opening lecture to negative culture diplomacy, where I referred to the Académie Française as one example. I want to zero in a little bit in the issue of quotas that I referred to, because I think it's an important issue that we can also look at in other countries of the world, also for other fields, not just radio. So I'll just give you a few facts here. So since its dealings with the 1993 GATT free trade negotiations, France has fought for what it calls the exception culturelle, or the cultural exception, meaning the right to subsidize or treat favorably domestic cultural production and to limit or control foreign products. For example, there exists a system of subsidies and preferential loans for supporting French cinema. The French quota bill was introduced on January 1st, 1996, after years of the cultural ministry urging radio stations to play more French music. So first there was a pressure where they were trying to urge the stations. That didn't work, so they said, all right, let's actually make a law, let's make legislation. It was introduced under Cultural Minister Jacques Toubon, and the bill states, and this is back in time, initially 40% of all music aired must be sung in French, with 20% consisting of new French bands. Radio stations risk fines of up to 5% of their average revenue, or even being taken off the air for not complying. So it's serious business. This is a crime. If you don't, follow these laws, you'll be taken off the air. So it's tough legislation in that sense. The bill was modified in 2000 so that stations were given different quotas according to listener demographics. Young radio stations, for example, had their quota reduced to 35% and 25% for new talent. And since 2000, it's even more complicated, so I don't even know what the statistics are today. It's always being re-examined almost on an annual basis. The point to take away here is, what do we think of this as an option for cultural diplomacy or cultural policy to actually, again, spend money to actually create legislation that will actually block or make it more difficult to have exchange. This is an example with the radio. Académie Française would be an example with language. I'd be curious also to hear your comments here too. I mean, do you think cultural diplomacy should just be about promoting or should it also be about limiting? And to be provocative, I very often will bring the Latvian ambassador and the French ambassador, or somebody from Latvia and France together, and I'll basically ask the French, what do you recommend for Latvia? Latvia is a small country. They don't have a big budget. Not many people speak Latvian around the world. Should they take France's policy, and start putting quotas and actually making it more difficult for Latvians to experience other European music or international music? Should they be, pushing the Latvian language and making sure it doesn't get influenced by other languages? Is this a good way of them using the small resources that they have? Or should Latvia do the opposite? And try to allow more interaction between Latvia and the rest of the world, more exchange, more exposure. And so I don't know. So I'd be curious if any of you have an opinion or perspective there. What do you make of negative cultural diplomacy? The benefit, of course, of this is that for me in Germany now, I can hear German music. And were it not for this, I think it's 20% quota in Germany, I probably wouldn't hear much German music. But is this a risk for countries to take? Should it be seen as an intermediary step? Does anyone have any feedback or comments there? Please, okay.
Yeah, I actually think that it's really important, especially when I was growing up in Kenya. The language is pretty much dying. There's 40 different languages in Kenya, and Swahili is really promoted, so everyone speaks Swahili. But the traditional languages are totally dying, and most of the people in the younger generation cannot speak to their grandmothers in their traditional languages. So I think it's called negative, but I actually think it's really important, and I think it's a good thing.
Okay. That's great, and in many ways I share that. I have mixed feelings myself. Other perspectives? Are there some cases where this is maybe more appropriate than others? Please. And then the other question, how do we balance the two? Because I agree, we don't want our own cultures to disappear. But how does one balance that also with the globalization? Please.
Oh yeah, I was wondering, it's like a balance. Like if you really think about it, if you kind of set the restrictions and you put limits and quotas on on external cultural influences on your country, that also has an economic impact as well as like a cultural impact. Because a lot of people, if they really don't want to know about a certain culture, if you impose something on them, I don't really agree that they'll actually take anything from it. You know what I mean? And also the economic side, it'll take away from the economic prosperity of the country because, originally quotas and tariffs, they don't really support the free market economics. So I don't know, it's kind of...
Okay. It's a good point. Part of me agrees with you as well. And it's a problem, though, because right now, in terms of cultural diplomacy, it's actually a survival of the fittest. So countries who are more successful economically usually have more chances to bring their cultures around the world, whereas other countries don't. I mean, France is really struggling also with their film industry. But it's interesting. I mean, I think France probably supports more than any country of the world, their film industry, I think. But for some reason, Hollywood, Nollywood, and Bollywood are actually the most successful three film industries, number-wise, around the world. Countries that don't actually have governmental influence or governmental funding or subsidies the same way as France. Why is that? Is another question to ask. And I think there are many answers, but please.
I think the diaspora plays a major role in the success of certain things, such as the film industry overseas. Because living in the UK, I know that, say, for example, that a lot of the Indian kids in the UK really support the Bollywood culture, and the African children, and predominantly the Nigerians, they support their Nollywood film culture as well. And all over London, you can now see Bollywood films being sold, films from Nigeria being sold. So I think that it's the pride of the diaspora and how much that they want to embrace their culture outside of the motherland. And also I think earlier on this week we spoke about image, and I think there was this message that you should focus more on knowledge than image. But being someone who specializes in destination branding, I would argue more for image. And what I find as well is that the first, second and third generation growing up, say for example in the UK, a lot of them are seeing very negative images in the UK about the country where their parents and grandparents came from, and it's becoming harder for them to embrace it and to take ownership of that part of their heritage. So I think that it's very important for countries not only to focus on people who they want to have knowledge about their country, but also focus on the diaspora as well, because it's very important that they feel proud of their heritage, their culture. And if all they're seeing are negative stereotypes and images, it's going to be very difficult for them to say, well, actually, I'm from Jamaica or Nigeria or Kenya or wherever, because they're not always seeing the type of images that instill that kind of pride. Of course, that's open for debate, but being a child of immigrants, I think I'm really speaking from experience when I say that.
Yep. No, I agree. I mean, I think the problem that you expressed is correct, and I think also the solution maybe lies in the same place. I think the diaspora has a huge role that they can play, and I think in some ways they are playing that role, sort of also to act as an ambassador or a translator, because the diaspora is in a very unique situation where they actually, are kind of between two worlds and two cultures. So I think that's also something that we should think about when we talk about cultural diplomacy. Instead of necessarily sending, lots and lots of Jamaicans to the UK, how can we work with maybe Jamaicans who are already there, and how can they also partner with embassies, with cultural diplomacy strategies, because they actually have a unique sort of translator capability in the sense that they, for the most part, grew up between two worlds. So that's an opportunity, I think, for the future of cultural diplomacy. You've inspired someone here, yeah?
I totally agree with what you said, and I also think if we're going to talk about where do you draw the line, when do you start implementing government policies, I think it has a lot to do with the state of decline, how desperate is the situation, or how much decline has already happened, and yeah, that's what I think.
Okay, excellent. Someone else, please.
I'm sorry, from the UK, I forgot your name. Yeah, and actually answered on your question yourself. Integration, it's called simply, and the main thing is how your your ancestors, your grandparents came, and then your now children, young generation is integrated. There are some things, for example, I can notice in Germany. Yeah, I have studied here for 1 year, and the main communities are here after Germans are Russians and Turks. I will talk about Berlin because I know more or less Berlin. And because I'm from Ukraine, I'm quite acquainted with Russian culture. And because I'm from Crimea, it's the region opposite of Turkey, so I'm more or less acquainted with the Turkish culture too. And what I saw in Berlin here, I actually was a bit upset concerning Russians and Turks because they try not to be really integrated, I mean in the positive meaning. They are proud about themselves, it's good. I'm also proud myself, but if I'm in another country, and especially if I live in this country, first of all, I must respect the rules and the laws of these countries. And not because they say, I'm a Turkish one, or I'm a Russian, it doesn't matter where I am. I will be drunk fully in the streets, or I can cry a lot in the U-Bahn, S-Bahn, or just these sunflower seeds, and spotting all over in the surroundings. I think it totally just, it's not good upbringing. And especially if they said their parents came here. So I think that different reasons why people leave their own countries and come to another country. They should show their best, and that other people look at you and say, okay, you're Ukrainian, Russian, or Turkish, and your good example, and that the people who like native from here, they will feel respecting you, not good feelings of you because of your bad behavior. For example, I'll talk about Ukraine, and especially about my folk. I'm Crimean Tatar, and it's actually the policy because we were first sent to exile to Uzbekistan because of Stalin regime. And as we came back, our policy was that, okay, we will invest in our youngsters. All the best we will give to education. We will try to find money to send them abroad, but they then should come back, not stay in West Europe and the USA. They should come back with that knowledge what they got there in order to improve their own country. And most of our youngsters are coming abroad, are crazy about that democracy and so on and so forth, and they're just ready to work here as a waiter, as I don't know, to clean streets or be in a hotel service, but only to live in West Europe or only to live in the USA. I think it's a wrong image. If you got so high education and your parents did their best, they gave the last money for your education, and then you stay, that you immigrate just because you don't want to come back to your own motherland, and just not try to use your knowledge and make your own people better. That's actually my point. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Actually, many points, but I think they're important points. I think the one issue that you raise is that we actually are all cultural diplomats, whether we know it or not. Everyone who travels abroad, everyone who lives abroad, or even lives in a different part of the same country that they're from. Everything that we do or don't do is an expression of who we are. Everything we say or don't say, and I think we have to take that seriously. And I think we are all representatives of our country, and we have an option there, and to show the best or the worst. So I think that's a responsibility not everybody necessarily realizes. So that's an important point. The other important point you raised was also brain drain, which is a problem that very often, we are sort of saying how great cultural diplomacy is and cultural exchange. Of course, one of the risks is that actually you won't go back home. And I think that's not always a problem, but it does cause challenges. And I think when it's too much in one direction, when it is a brain drain, that can be a problem for the country that's actually losing the brains, so to speak. But it can also, I think, be a good thing to allow people the freedom to move, and live wherever they want. So it's a tricky issue. There's no easy answer, but thank you for sharing those points. I want to actually now, we were just making a few references to the UK, conclude by discussing a little bit also the United Kingdom. And then we can wrap up the lecture. So United Kingdom, again, there are many examples that we could discuss when it comes to cultural diplomacy. I just want to focus on one, which is actually the leading cultural diplomacy institute of the UK, which is the British Council. And the main reason that I want to illustrate this is examine this is to demonstrate the point, or to pose the question for you. Cultural diplomacy in challenge relationships, what role does it have? And then also cultural diplomacy with friends or partner countries. Where is there a need for cultural diplomacy, and how does one observe different needs? Let's say the British Council in Germany and the British Council in Iraq, for example. So that's the main point that I want to go to in demonstrating also a little bit more detail about the British Council. So first of all, the agent, the British Council. Regulated as a charity, the British Council was established in 1934 and incorporated by Royal Charter in 1940. It is the UK's international cultural relations body. So again, 1934, I think, again, we can probably assume, and I think in many ways if you read the literature, this is also proven, that the British Council was also, similar to the Germans, an attempt after the First World War to really try to make some contributions to peace and sustaining relations around the world. Then during the Second World War, it obviously grew. And as you see here, it was officially part of the Royal Charter in 1940. Let's take something officially from the British Council's website. The British Council operates at arm's length from the UK governments and does not carry out its functions on behalf of the Crown. However, the Secretary of State for Foreign Commonwealth Affairs is answerable to Parliament for the policies, operations, and performance of the British Council, whilst the Foreign and Commonwealth Office is the British Council's sponsoring department. In terms of funding, 705 million is the annual turnover, 211 million in governmental grants, 201 million from the FCO, Contract work with the Department for International Development, the EU, and other international bodies helps generate annual income. So they're a little bit vague on the homepage about this. So basically, the first part of that we can also interpret as governmental funding. They're calling it contract work for the Department of International Development, but obviously that's governmental funding too. And then they also earn money offering courses similar to the Goethe Institute, as well as other sponsors. So it's a mixture. I think at a macro level, it's roughly half of their funding. It depends obviously country to country, but roughly half comes from the government somehow, either direct grants or this contract work that they're referring to. The other half depends, as they mentioned, European Union, other international bodies, fees they charge for taking tests there, language tests, and language classes. They have 210 offices in 110 countries, so pretty big in terms of magnitude. Definitely, in the leagues of Goethe Institute, actually more so, and almost approaching the numbers of Confucius, but not quite. The agenda of the British Council, defined in the founding charter as promoting abroad a wider appreciation of British culture and civilization by encouraging cultural, educational, and other interchanges between the United Kingdom and elsewhere. Continuing, global events of recent years, coupled with a growing trend, especially online, for people to trust peers they've never met before over governments, businesses, and institutions, reinforce our belief that the idea of cultural relations between people worldwide has come of age. This work really can change lives of the world we live in for the better. So again, you see here the idea of cultural relations. As I was saying, the British Council is very particular that they call their work cultural relations, not cultural diplomacy. However, as you can see in the first sentence, part of their mission is promoting abroad a wider appreciation of British culture. So again, I think the one sort of counteracts the other. I think they're trying to be neutral by saying they're just doing cultural relations. On the other hand, they also confess their goal is to promote abroad a wider appreciation of British culture, or to win the hearts and minds of foreign audiences. The main focuses are on educational promotion and provision, creativity through the arts and science programs, human rights projects, and training for community and sports leadership. So that's officially their agenda. Let's continue with the agenda. Actually, I have two more quotes. This is from Demos, which is a think tank also based in the UK. The UK boasts a strong tradition of international cultural exchange through the British Council's presence around the globe, and also via the dense global networks of our national cultural institutions and diaspora communities. Professor Taylor, who's based at the University of Leeds, goes on, in India, the British Council puts on a series of events at a chain of fashionable coffee shops, popular with students of the Indian Institute for Technology and other top universities. Top British DJs and comedians were featured, and the aim of taking the message of British creativity to important and oft-courted audiences. The idea was to associate Britain with creativity and top music in the minds of India's young. Of course, the UK's Olympiad ahead in 2012 Games also presents a myriad of possibilities for asserting brand Britannia across the planet. So that's another important point of their agenda. This is a specific example in India, but there is a little bit of nation branding going on. They're trying to, similar to Deutsche Welle, present a certain image of their country abroad through their work. So I think one can really make the argument that there is an agenda of, let's say, I don't want to use the word propaganda, but showing off the good things about Britain to the world and really getting people to like Britain more. So it's fairly present and fairly transparent. Even on their webpage, they make reference to that. What about the vehicle? The British Council has established 2,700 school links connecting more than 1 million pupils worldwide, helping to bring 450,000 foreign students to the UK, generating $8.5 billion for the British economy. So again, they're bringing students who then pay tuition once they're in the UK. Building libraries across the world. British Institute libraries in Burma, for example, attract 250,000 visits a year, and 60,000 people visited its information centers in Zimbabwe last year, just to give you guys a few numbers. Training English teachers across the world. There are 750,000 trainees in India alone, so the training is a big portion of their work. Supporting the work of 1,000 international climate champions, which they call young campaigners, in over 60 countries, raising awareness and understanding of climate change and giving them access to international leaders. So here you see also a little bit of indirect cultural diplomacy, and this is becoming more of a trend with the British Council, where they'll bring people together to talk about climate change, which I think is actually a very important mechanism for cultural diplomacy. They're actually trying to solve and actually raise awareness of real-world issues through their cultural diplomacy, which I would argue is actually better than getting people together to talk about British identity or German identity, but get them together to talk about real issues that they can actually collaborate on together. Also showcasing British talents internationally, such as at the Venice Biennale. So again, you have with British Council a mixture. On the one hand, a little bit of showing off the great cultural contributions of Britain. On the other hand, and this is in recent years, their shift, to try to also tackle global issues through the exchanges that they're doing. That, for me, is an even more attractive methodology for the future. Target audience is, again, fairly diverse, but I can give you a few examples. So different types, right, this is actually also, you can see this in the mandate of the culture of the British Council. They've actually grouped different kinds of countries together, where they have somewhat different strategies for those countries. There's what they call lifeline countries, where they put Burma and Zimbabwe. What they call building trust countries, Middle East and Pakistan. What they call developing countries, such as Nigeria. Also open and developed countries with strong pre-existing ties to the USA, such as France, the USA. So they actually do have somewhat different strategies for different countries, which is interesting. Most of the other cultural diplomacy institutions are not so transparent in doing this. As I said, DAD also has priorities in terms of also which countries they put more emphasis on, which countries they have less. And then they also break it down, 3 main target groups. T1, or target group 1, is high-level decision makers and leaders, including governmental ministers, leading cultural personalities, national religious leaders, and UK-based ambassadors of overseas countries. So this is the high level, the VIPs, where they'll do high-level events, in the British Embassy here in Berlin or in the Berlin City Hall, etc. That's their one target audience. T2, key influencers, including current leading members of organizations who develop or deliver policy. So this is the multiplier group. So basically heads of NGOs, heads of networks, etc. T3, what they call people with potential. These are far more numerous and tend to be younger, usually under the age of 35, including students of English and those wishing to study overseas. So here the British Council has given a lot of thought to actually which target audience they're focusing on. And I think it's, again, an interesting model. I think this is something that the cultural diplomacy student could also take and apply to other countries. So when you're creating your own strategies of cultural diplomacy, I'd recommend maybe doing something similar to the British Council. You may not agree with the way they actually classify the world into different regions, or you may have different T1, T2, T3, but I think it is a valuable approach to basically ask yourself, all right, what is the difference of doing cultural diplomacy in Iraq and doing it in Germany? Because there is a difference. There are different challenges. Your country is perceived different in different countries. Your country is presented differently in different countries. There are different stereotypes in different countries. And all of those really do call for a unique cultural diplomacy. I would always say cultural diplomacy needs to be really very, very specific. So every relationship is unique, although that's making it very difficult for you if you have no reference points. So the British Council is making it a little bit easier for you and saying, all right, true, every country is different, but we can make some generalizations. So maybe countries where we had a particular historical experience have some things in common. Other regions also have things in common. So it's a 2-tiered way that they break down their target audience. Let's continue. All right, so yeah, so that actually, in terms of target audience, was the main thing that I wanted to discuss with you in terms of the agent. Now what I want to do is explain to you a transition that the British Council has had over the last 6 years. I made reference to this also in the earlier lecture. Initially, the British Council in Berlin was a huge 5-story building, open to the public, media center downstairs, teaching English, etc., where they said, look, we really need to bring British culture to Germany. As I mentioned, about 6 years ago, they moved to the eastern part of the city, a small office, 4th floor building. You need basically, there's a video camera, you ring a bell to get in, closed to the public, and it's really only the T1, T2, and T3 that are allowed up there. So the high-level decision makers, the key influencers, or the people with potential, and that's it. I think this was done for 2 reasons. First of all, limited resources. So I think they realized, all right, in general, times of austerity, etc., in general, the British Council is doing somewhat less now than it was before. Second reason is reallocating resources, where they really pose the question, look, why does Germany need the British Council? They're so close to us, they can come here with EasyJet for 20 euros, they can look at Britain's Got Talent. There's really no need. Let's take those resources and put them somewhere else where there's a bigger need. And this is the conversation that I wanted to have with you all right now. What do you make of that, in the sense, how does one deal with friends or countries where you have close relations or a lot of activity? How do we deal with enemies, or how do we deal with situations where there's a country where we have no interaction? And a quote I can make reference to from one of our advisory board members His name is Alexander Langolius. He's the former German politician, now head of the Checkpoint Charlie Foundation, which is doing German-American exchange. And we were talking about the German-American relationship, and he said, Mark, friendships are not like light switches that you can turn on and off when you need them. You've got to send a Christmas card at least once a year. And that was his analogy for the German-American relationship, where many Germans felt as if the Americans turned off the light switch at the end of the Cold War by closing all of the America houses, by really pulling back in many ways. So that we could apply also for the British-German relationship in the sense, how do we send a Christmas card once a year from the UK to Germany? I think some sort of a Christmas card in the figurative sense is necessary, but what? Maybe it's not necessarily necessary for the British Council to teach English. Maybe they don't need to necessarily have, I don't know, film screenings or showing TV shows or Britain's Got Talent. But I think something is needed. And I think there, especially in the case of the British Council or the UK, I think especially now, many are quite skeptical, actually. Can Europe really stay together as a European Union? It's being tested, it's being pressured from all sides. And that's one of the big conversations that I think the UK and Germany needs to have more of in terms of, how do we come closer to the opinion also on the European Union, where you have a lot of skeptics in Britain who basically say, look, we've got our pound, we don't need the euro, and we don't even need the European Union. So just as one example of the kind of conversation that I think would be beneficial for maybe a somewhat bigger British Council in Berlin, and to the same token, I think also the challenges for Germany, how they also build these bridges from their side in the UK. So maybe I'll use that as maybe a way of concluding this particular lecture. And